Okay, for those accessing this Google Hangout afterwards, we're just starting the session now, 5 minutes before the top of the hour, and we'll wait for people to join, and then we'll start the conversation in about 5 minutes. Okay, we might start the session. Welcome everyone to this Google Hangout for the Extractives massive online course being run by SDSN, but also the Columbia Center and a whole host of other partners. I guess we are technically challenged a little bit this morning. The question and answer function of the Google Hangout is not working for us today, unfortunately. So what I'll ask is if you could please just post on the event page, as some people have already started to do, your questions. I'm going to be starting from the bottom and go to the top, and hopefully we'll get through all of the questions that you have about the session this week, which is on the environment. My name is Dr. Daniel Franks. I work for the United Nations Development Programme, and I am the Program Manager of the ACP EU Development Minerals Programme. And our program is focused on so-called low-value minerals and materials. We like to think of them as neglected development minerals. So we're talking about construction materials, industrial minerals, dimension stones, and semi-precious stones. But my work has been, about sustainable development in the extractive sector throughout my career. Previously, I was at the University of Queensland before joining UNDP. So I welcome any questions related to sustainable development and extractives. I mean, certainly I'd like to focus today as much as possible on environment, but if we should stray a little bit on either side of the environment topic, I think that's fine. Though if we have a lot of questions, I'll move back to try and prioritize those environment questions. I hope you enjoyed the lectures this week. I tried to keep them short. I tried to keep them succinct to make sure that they were easy for you to get through. Talked about the impacts of on the environment from the mining sector, but also the oil and gas sector, and then tried to throw in there some discussion about, well, how do you address those impacts? What are the type of policy instruments that are available to try and make sure that we deal with the change that the mining sector and oil and gas sector brings? So with that all said, I'll start right at the bottom of our stream. And the first question, I think, was not really related to the environment, but it was asking how in emerging countries can we move forward in this current economy when mineral prices are down? And this is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer question for us because the work that we're doing at UNDP. So the first point to make is that not all commodity prices are down at the moment. Oil is definitely down a lot, and some of the key metals have suffered huge price declines from the very high prices that we're experiencing over the past decade, particularly things like iron ore, copper, gold to some extent as well. So metal prices are down and the oil price is down, but there are commodities that are really important for domestic development, commodities that are important for domestic development that haven't suffered a price fall. Here we're talking about the industrial minerals, the non-metallic minerals that are really important for manufacturing sector in domestic economies, but also the construction materials, the aggregates, the sands, the limestone that build domestic economies, the phosphate that's important for fertilizer. So there's a whole host of minerals that are actually really important for domestic development that aren't necessarily linked to international commodity markets that are still reasonably priced and can contribute to the development of economies. So there is a lot of discussion about what to do in the context of metal price declines, but we need to think about things a little bit more broadly and need to diversify the discussion and the economy so that countries don't run into the trap of being dependent on single commodities that have historically showed huge price fluctuations. Moving up, there's a comment here, Daniel Franks is an excellent speaker. I think that's a really, really important comment. I'll take that as a statement rather than a question. Moving up even further, okay, we've got a series of questions here from the forum. So the first question is, in order to avoid serious and irreversible environmental harm, what precautionary principles and approaches the extractive industries have developed? And let's just refresh. I've got to go back down again. what precautionary principles have the extractive industries developed, and how these principles transformed into operational measures in specific field of natural resources. Okay, so obviously the environment movement was important in defining a series of ways to think about, a series of principles that can guide projects so that when they are implemented, they don't lead to large-scale environmental change. Now, they have been codified in a number of practices in the mining sector. The most common practice is the environmental impact assessment process. An environmental impact assessment is a requirement from government for a project to develop an assessment of what's the current environmental situation or baseline where this project will be developed, and then what are the potential impacts that might arise from that project. It usually includes some scientific studies across the whole suite of different topics, be they biodiversity, sedimentation, water, etc., and also a process for engagement with the public to comment on those scientific studies. I think that's the main process that's used in the extractive sector to try and account for environmental issues. Because the mining sector and the oil and gas sector are so well defined, they're not very expansive in terms of their lateral extent. It's usually very high impact over a very small area of land. There is going to be major environmental change associated with the project. So in a lot of the impact assessments, what we're talking about is mitigating those issues. There is a mitigation hierarchy, which is, I guess, another form of principle that is kind of common. The mitigation hierarchy includes to avoid impact, minimize impact, restore or rehabilitate impacts, offset those impacts, or if you can, enhance the impacts if they're positive impacts. And the hierarchy is such that you try and avoid impact first before you're leading to the furthest away, which is offsetting. If you can't avoid that impact, what can you do to offset that impact? The other kind of ways in which principles around environmental management are in practice in the sector are through environmental risk assessments. These are kind of common as well. The risk assessments are undertaken to work out what are the main activities that this project is undertaking, what are the risks associated with it, what are the consequences if those risks play out. So those risk assessments then can sometimes lead to what's called standard operating procedures. So a series of behavioural practices that a mining company will implement to try and avoid serious environmental risks. I should also say that environmental impact assessments also lead to practical documents such as environmental management plans. So taking the impact assessment and trying to make it something that can be used in a practical way. Environmental monitoring is also quite common in the sector, and I would say that the one interesting way that environmental monitoring can take place is through participatory monitoring, because some of the big challenges in the mining sector, there is a lack of trust with the public around impacts, particularly water impacts. So participatory monitoring and participatory water monitoring has arisen as a kind of a very interesting practice whereby members of the public are involved in the monitoring process. Sometimes they lead the monitoring process, send the materials to their own labs, so that there's trust in the findings of those monitoring efforts. Okay, the next question was, in order to quantify evidence of the impacts of the extractive industries on biodiversity and the ecosystem functions and services, what practical methodologies do you suggest? And there's a specific question around trophic levels, etc. So a biologically focused question. Well, I'm not going to cop out and say that I'm not a botanist or a zoologist. I'm not, but I will try and answer the question. That is that there has been an effort to put in place some standards of undertaking biodiversity assessments in the sector. I will point you towards some really interesting literature. The Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism in Australia have a really great handbook series, a best practice handbook series in mining. It's been around for about 10 years, but they keep updating the handbooks. There's a really neat guide there on biodiversity management, which I think that would probably answer your question in quite a lot of detail. I'll post that right now on this this Google site here. There's a link right there to the handbook series. It's the one on biodiversity is very good, as they all are, and there's a whole series of issues there. The International Council for Mining Metals also recently just put out a guidebook on biodiversity management, and that was in association with the oil and gas sector as well. So I'll find the link here as well, and send you those details. Here it is. Okay, the next question is, what evolutionary relations exist between natural resources and biogeochemical cycles, and how extractions of minerals may affect the biodiversity ecosystem service relationship? And to what extent can diverse impacts from multiple natural resources on biodiversity ecosystem functioning relationships be evaluated? Well, it's a very complex question. I will say that, you know, mining doesn't have a huge lateral extent. So it's only under specific biomes or specific ecosystems would you expect the mining industry to have an impact on a whole type of ecosystem. Instead, what we see is very intense impacts over small areas. Often mining leases are quite large and include a large portion of the mining lease that is not disturbed in terms of clearing of biodiversity. The soils over mines in particular, ore bodies are quite unique. Often they're high in metals. So there are some quite specific plants that are metallophytes that exist in circumstances of high metal content that are very specific to mining regions. So there is some work that the Centre for Mine Land Rehabilitation in Australia and the University of Queensland has been doing on those species, particularly the use of those species for rehabilitation, which is very interesting because some of those species collect metals. So you know, it's not an issue that should be dismissed. There are specific ecosystems that have a relationship to the particular geochemistry of the soils beneath them. But aside from that, I think that you know, another area might be mineral sands. So mineral sands are usually in circumstances where the soils are very poor. So it's very difficult, and mineral sands also have a quite wide lateral extent. They're quite long. So they tend to be very fragile soils. So re-establishing those ecosystems is often quite difficult. They have indurated layers sometimes in the sand that create little aquifers as well that are hard to replicate. So the specific circumstance in which the extraction project is located will impact the relationship to the specific biodiversity above it. And really what is needed is very specific studies and very specific and careful attention to those particular issues at that site. Moving up, we've got a question about social development. So the social impacts of projects don't last for a long time and disappear when the extractive project is over. Currently, we're speaking about sustainable social development. According to your experience, how can we reach this objective, and do you have examples? Okay, so we're straying away from the topic of environment, but I'll briefly answer the question. And that is that when we approach closure of projects, often projects will put in place a closure management plan, or they might even undertake, rarely, a closure impact assessment. I guess there's two kind of issues that tend to play out. One is, what's the immediate impact of closure, particularly on jobs, because you're reducing a workforce and that's impacting the community that are living in a region. But beyond that, what is the legacy that this project is leaving over the life of the project? So that question, that second question, the bigger question, is something that needs to be attacked or addressed from the start of a project or before a project starts. The best way to do that is to have a planning process in place. That might be through an agreement-making process with communities and government, you know, and in that process you lock down what are the specific things that a community and a government can expect from a project that'll have a long-lasting impact for that region, that'll last beyond the life of a project. To do that, often you need to frame that agreement or frame that planning process in a way that thinks about the future. Oftentimes when extractives projects come to a region, community will demand some things that are very short-term, very perhaps not meaningful over the lifetime of a project. And sometimes it requires government or the companies themselves to prompt a different way of thinking about the issue. An example is that in Australia there was a coal mine called the Blair Athol coal mine that was closing, and the same company was opening a new coal mine called the Claremont coal mine. And local government approached the company and said, look, if you're going to open this new coal mine, what we'd like from you is this list of things, these list of investments in our town. A lot of them were very short-term thinking type investments. Instead, the company said, well, let's do a community planning process that says, what do you want the future to look like in this town in 2030, in 2040, in 2050? And then once we've done that planning process, what are the things that we need to invest between now and then to get to that point? There's been other examples like that in Antofagasta, in Chile, in many other regions. You see these purposeful planning processes to say, what do we need to do between now and sometime in the future to make sure that this project leaves a good, lasting social legacy? Our next question is about question about Central Africa. It says, it's full of natural resources and it's still a poor region. How can we build a solid baseline relevant for decision-making and documenting social changes, such as strong data for social indicators, pre and post-impact? Well, I think there's different ways to approach this, but the main way to approach it is to have a solid social impact assessment associated with any project proposal and linked to the environmental impact assessment. These are usually funded by the project proponent, are required by government, and they allow social practitioners to undertake demographic studies of the region that's being impacted to get a social baseline or what's called sometimes a profile, and then use that to project and to engage with community, but to do some quantitative and qualitative studies to work out what are the likely impacts from a particular project and what kind of management strategies need to be put in place to address those impacts. Beyond project-specific impact assessments, if you've got a region, for example, that has many different projects in it, you can do sector-specific assessments or sometimes regional or community cumulative impact assessments. Sometimes they're called strategic assessments or regional assessments. And these take a bigger geographic area and allow you to think about the interrelationships between multiple projects, between different industries, etc. But essentially, I think you need a requirement from government often to get these processes happening. Some companies have committed to undertake impact assessments regardless of whether there's a regulatory requirement. And there's a whole host of literature available on social impact assessment. I was a co-author with Professor Frank Van Clay on the new social impact assessment guidance document for the International Association for Impact Assessment. So I will search that on the internet now, and I'll post the link to that as well. So you can see what are the kind of studies that people suggest, or the ways to approach social impact assessment, so that you can make sure that projects lead to long-term positive legacies, what we're talking about earlier. While I'm searching for that, I'll move on to the next one. I'd like to know how to end conflicts associated with land and water in mining projects. That's a great question. Wouldn't we all like to know that? I think the best way to resolve conflicts is to try and not to get into protracted conflicts in the first instance. And the reason I say that is because I often liken conflicts between extractive companies and communities like a marriage. How often is it that you see divorced couples getting back together and remarrying. It's very rare. Once you get to the stage of an escalated conflict or a conflict that is protracted, it's very difficult to retrieve those relationships. It's just like any human relationship. What we tend to see with extractives-related conflicts is most the triggers for those conflicts are related to environmental issues. But the background issues that lead to the state of the relationship tend to be socioeconomic and relationship style issues. For example, the quality of consultation and consent processes, that kind of thing. Now, if there are processes that can be put in place to try and resolve some of the conflictual issues that might arise. I think that there in Latin America, there is probably the best example. There's almost a movement, you'd call it, for processes called dialogue tables. I would encourage you to look up on the internet. There's quite a lot of information available on these dialogue processes. The Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining at the University of Queensland did a study recently on dialogue processes and looked at what are the success factors in those processes to try and resolve issues around community conflict. I'll try and remember as well to post a link to the dialogue processes document, so that might help answer your question further. Okay, someone asks here, I don't understand the real difference between command and control regulation and market-based instruments. Can someone please help me? Okay, so a command and control regulation is something that a government will specify or require of a company, a proponent, through legislation. Now, it's usually, I'll give you an example. So if there may be some specific type of, actually, I'll first describe a market-based instrument, then give you an example of both. Okay, so a command and control process, a regulation, is when a government specifies that a company needs to do something, to employ some type of technology or to undertake some kind of process. A market-based instrument is instead where a market is created, an incentive is provided for companies to decide how they'd like to approach an issue. So the example might be greenhouse gas emissions. So government has a choice. It can set a cap on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that it would like to have in its own economy, and then allow a system of trading between companies for permits to emit those emissions. That would be a market-based instrument. It'd be called an emissions trading scheme. Alternately, a government could say, instead of doing an emissions trading scheme, we're just going to specify that particular companies use particular technologies that mean that those greenhouse gas emissions are lowered. That would be a command and control regulation. So the market-based instrument allows the company to make choices on its own of what kind of processes or practices it would like to put in place to achieve that same environmental outcome that's been asked for by the government. And you're creating an incentive through the market for that action to take place. There's plenty of information online about market-based instruments and command and control regulation. So I'd encourage you to look at that more for greater explanation. The next question is, I'd like to know what is paste technology in the extractive industries, and what does it mean to burn coal and gas in the extractive industries? Okay, so paste technology refers to a type of technology that creates a particular waste stream. So in the mining of metals, most of the material that's mined ends up being either waste rock or what's called tailings. Now, tailings is the crushed up rock that is left over after you've separated the metal that you want out of the rock from the rock. Usually it's just ground up clays, silica minerals, etc. But within those tailings often are sulfide minerals that, when they're exposed to oxygen and water, break down and create acid. And sometimes, even though they don't create acid, can still mobilize metals into the rock, and then when water percolates through that rock, can mobilize it into waterways. Now, most tailings is stored in a dam, which is made up of ground up rock. So it's as a wet slurry, it's called. The waste tailings is transported. Usually it contains a lot of water within that slurry, and into a dam where it settles and the water evaporates. And the dam has a face that stops that ground up rock from eroding into waterways. Now, there are technologies called paste and thickened tailings technologies that essentially get that tailings material and extract the water out of it before it's deposited into this tailings storage facility. And it reduces the amount of water in the tailings, and it increases the density of the tailings. So the tailings themselves are more stable, they're more inert, and they're more contained. And what that means is that the thickening of the tailings means that the tailings is has a better environmental outcomes in most cases. They tend to have less collapses, they tend to have a smaller surface area, and also you can recycle the water that you've taken out of that rock. So it's essentially a process for thickening those tailings. And paste is at the far end of that thickening process, where you've got the most amount of water taken out. It's quite a complicated topic, but essentially it's my view that with the greater uptake of paste and thickened tailings technologies, you'd have much fewer tailings dam failure incidents and incidents related to the pollution of tailings into waterways. And the uptake of that technology, I think, would have greater sustainability outcomes. We have the next question about, says that they agree that the combination of industry, government, and national institutions can drive change for any issue. He's from Suriname, where corruption is high. There has been little effort to fight corruption with almost no action from government. Are there examples of small resource-rich countries that have been able to combat corruption and implement the EITI? Okay, we're straying a little bit off topic here, but I'll give a short answer, and that is that there are many countries that have had a movement around Publish What You Pay, and that movement has led to the adoption of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and regular reporting of EITI reports has identified instances where corruption has occurred and exposed those incidences. So the EITI is a process essentially for exposing those potential instances of corruption. So it's a way, it's a means, it's a mechanism of improving corruption outcomes in countries. And the EITI puts out an annual report which often includes lots and lots of examples of cases where transparency has improved those outcomes. Here we go. What strong guidelines to promote or put in place resettlement with compensation for local communities? And monetary and non-monetary changes to the life conditions for communities. Okay, so resettlement is an area that there's been problematic practice in the extractive sector, and there's been a recent effort to try and improve resettlement outcomes in mining. I would encourage you to look at the miningresettlement.org site that has been put together by the Centre for Social Responsibility Mining, led by a good colleague of mine, Associate Professor Deanna Kemp. They have a huge host of resources available for resettlement specific to the mining context. I know that they have a mining and resettlement library. They were part of we also held a couple of years ago, International Symposium on Resettlement, which there are documents available related to that. And this renewed effort in resettlement has also led to, I know that the International Council for Mining and Metals, the peak body of the international mining industry, has recently put out a kind of a best practice document of resettlement in the mining sector. So I'd encourage you also to look at the ICMM's website, and I'll post some of these links afterwards related to those two examples. Okay. Next question, how do we facilitate genuine community engagement processes with all stakeholders using free, prior and informed consent? Okay, so FPIC is usually used, free, prior, informed consent, in the context of Indigenous communities. And the reason for that is Indigenous communities have sovereignty over the land in which they are custodians of, and specific consent processes put in place by either the government through a native title type system, or companies themselves can help address circumstances where Indigenous communities do not consent to developments, yet developments have gone ahead anyway. So there's now quite, again, a lot of guidance internationally available on free, prior and informed consent. And some advocacy organisations have started to talk about free, prior and informed consent in the context of non-Indigenous communities as well. Now, there's a complication here, and that is that on the one hand, you've got the particular issues that might arise and particular perspectives that that local communities might have that are different to the general populace. But you've also got a political system usually in that place that leads to decision-making around projects. That political system involves local governments, state governments and federal governments. They have divisions of powers, and they decide whether projects should go ahead or not, depending on the laws and regulations that they have. Putting in place on top of that an additional process for local communities for free, prior and informed consent can complicate matters. Now, it may lead to better outcomes in some circumstances. Whatever the case, it needs to dovetail with the laws and regulations of the country that might guide decision-making in general. Because if you've got two conflicting systems, you can get perverse outcomes. Having said that, there are examples of local municipalities putting forward referenda around whether extractive projects should go ahead. And sometimes those referenda are recognised by state and regional governments, sometimes they are not. But there's plenty of available guidance. I don't think it's a disputed area anymore in terms of what constitutes free, prior, informed consent. What are the best practices related to community consultation and community engagement? There are plenty of documents around that would specify those things, including the social impact assessment guidance that I'll share with you later as well. I should also say that most of the industry associations in the extractive sector also have guidance documents, so do companies, around what constitutes good practice in this area. And there's not a lot of conjecture over what those practices should be. I think that the problem is that they're often not implemented in practice on the ground. So that's the big challenge, is taking the principles that everyone kind of agrees on and putting those in place in practice. Scrolling up now to safety issues. Safety issues are very important. The next question: how to motivate companies to apply international standards to mining to prevent accidents and mass killings of people. Are there any statistics of accidents in mining and their causes? Okay, now we're getting a very wide array of questions. I do encourage you to please post some specific questions around environment on the guidance on this event page. I'll briefly answer this question. Health and safety is an area that we focus on in our program here, but occupational health and safety has not been my specific focus of my working profession. But I would say that usually legislation requirements are the big driver for health and safety practice in the mining sector and oil and gas sector, but increasingly the extractive industries have taken on board, through the advocacy of unions, through the advocacy also of management, a greater attention to health and safety, especially the large-scale multinational mining companies. The International Council for Mining and Metals, again, they collect statistics on health and safety incidents in the mining sector for their members. So I'd point you in the direction of those for specific statistics. I also know that there are lots of studies available on the type of accidents that happen in the sector and what are the ways in which to approach them. There is a centre called the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Centre that has lots of information available for for people interested in finding out more. I remember there being a question about CO2 here somewhere. Okay, so here's a question around carbon emissions. The question is, my take is that the challenge to reduce CO2 emissions from industries, for example, mining, with very large excavators and haul trucks, and for example, alumina refineries, is difficult. Running cars with batteries seems impossible, but doing that for these large equipment seems impossible. The other example is a specific alumina process, which is being done by gas and oil firing. The question is, how do I see the challenge and what solutions are to be expected? Okay, so the first thing is that each different type of mining or oil and gas production will have a different type of extraction, a different type of processing, and a different suite of equipment. So a lot of metal mining tends to happen through large-scale open pit or open cut mining. In that context, you are blasting rock. You are then transporting that rock with diesel haul trucks to a grinding facility and crushing facility. Then you're crushing that rock, then transporting that rock usually by conveyor belt to a mineral processing facility, and then you are, depending on the metal, concentrating in that in some form, or maybe even refining it, but often just to the concentration phase. Now, the types of energy that are used in that process, well, the blasting is through dynamite. The haul trucks are usually run by diesel, this is for open cut mining. The crushing and grinding is usually run by electricity, and there are examples of mine sites that are using photovoltaic solar to produce the electricity for functioning of processing, or at least supplementing that electricity on site. The electric vehicles don't tend to happen with haul trucks in an open pit context, but in underground mining, there's quite a high usage of electric vehicles. So the question contends that it's impossible to do. In fact, I would say the opposite. I would say that electric vehicles in mining seems like a very easy solution to the greenhouse gas emissions problem. The issue, though, is whether there's enough of a driver in terms of a market, if there's a price on carbon, or in terms of other forms of regulation that will mean that it makes it economic for the mining sector to shift to those forms of energy production for their use. Obviously, in oil and gas, it's different, and the methane that is sometimes produced during production is often can be captured to create electricity on site for production, but generally energy isn't used a lot in the oil and gas extraction process. It's more in the refining process down the line. The questioner mentioned alumina refining. Well, actually, aluminium refining tends to be predominantly done in the context of hydropower, just because it can be very expensive to use so much electricity. Alumina refining is very energy intensive, of course. So hydropower tends to be the main form of electricity generation for alumina refining. There are examples where coal is used, but it tends to be hydropower already. I think the technologies are available. I've even seen some mine sites do studies about the feasibility of solar thermal. I think the challenge, though, is it economic to shift towards these changed energy systems for the production side of mining? I will say that the extraction site tends to use less energy than processing site, which is more energy intensive. Okay, scrolling up. Okay, it says, according to lecture you said in the video, do solar panels also produce carbon dioxide? Okay, so this is in reference to the fourth module of the program, which I wasn't the speaker for that module. That was Professor Jeffrey Sachs. But I did listen that he said that solar panels produce almost no carbon dioxide. I think I think his point is that given the amount of energy that they create, the amount of carbon dioxide used to put those solar panels together is very low, which I think is a valid point. Obviously, in the production of anything, we potentially use carbon dioxide in the manufacturing process of photovoltaic solar. But the amount of energy that's produced by that photovoltaic solar that is much greater than the amount of it that's used to manufacture it. The next question is, many problems in mining and elsewhere involve excessive water demands between communities and companies. How can these be resolved preemptively? This is an excellent question. I would say that one of the main drivers of conflict in the extractive sector tends to be over water. We did a major study of 50 mine community conflicts and talked to a lot of practitioners, also in the oil and gas sector, around these conflicts. And this was done with a colleague of mine, Rachel Davis, from an organisation called Shift. The study was called The Cost of Conflict in the Extractive Industries. And we also then produced an academic study from that for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I think it's one of your readings for this week. Water was indeed one of the key proximate issues, the issues that tend to trigger or drive conflict. And it's an area that is very contested. So I think that the main way to approach these issues, for me, I think tends to be needing to have a robust environmental impact assessment process with good community engagement and consultation arrangements prior to projects being put in place. I think there's a lack of confidence from lots of community members and other water users, say, for example, the agriculture sector around a project. Mine sites do tend to use a large amount of water, but the amount of water that's being used is being improved. So there's a lot of recycling that occurs on mine sites now, and there is a big push to undertake water recycling. That doesn't mean that they can't impact water sources in the vicinity of projects, but it does mean that the amount of water that's being used is more efficient than it has been in the past for some projects. I guess the type of issues that tend to arise are twofold. One is the water extraction, or the amount of water that's being used for a project, and the other is the quality of the water that's being discharged from a project. And they're two kind of separate issues. Where the project gets its water from will obviously have a huge impact on the type of conflict that may or may not arise around a project. So some sites might extract water from groundwater, some sites might extract it from local waterways, some sites might have dams that are purpose-built or not purpose-built for projects to provide water. The second issue is the downstream impacts, and they tend to be around water pollution issues. One, from surface runoff, which might contain sedimentation, but two, and this is the most common, from discharge from the bottom of tailings dams or from the other areas of the site that is containing metals from acid and metalliferous drainage. A lot of tailings dams have this challenge, like I said earlier, because a lot of tailings dams have these sulfide minerals that break down and release metals. So one way is to design your waste disposal strategy such that the acid forming material is separated from the non-acid forming material, that you cap and cover tailings dams, etc. So there's design features of a mine that can help influence the downstream impacts on waterways. The other thing might be the design of water retention ponds, etc. And it's obviously going to be very different whether you're in a water saturated environment or a water scarce environment. So in a water scarce environment, you tend to have more issues around the water sources that a project is using. In a water-saturated environment, you tend to have more issues around the pollution from sedimentation and from mobilization of metals downstream. The key way in which you can address conflicts between water users around the pollution issues is to put in place a robust water monitoring process that's a participatory process. Now, the International Finance Corporation has a guidance document available on participatory water monitoring that they piloted at Yanacocha and a number of other sites. And I think that there's plenty of examples now where participatory water monitoring improves the trust deficit that exists around the data around the impact of the mine or the oil and gas facility on water. The upstream issues tend to be very contested as well. It's obviously going to depend. It's hard to answer in the abstract. It depends a lot on the type of water extraction that a mine or an oil and gas facility is using and the other water users downstream. Okay, the next question is monitoring and follow-up of the environmental and social impact management plans. Implementation is a big issue in many areas since this requires skills and personnel which are usually not available in state agencies. This is an excellent question. A big focus of my work in the past has been taking these ideas of impact assessments and putting them into a process of having an ongoing way of addressing those impacts over the life cycle of projects. Now, impact assessments can be operationalized as management plans, and those management plans should be based on risk. It should be based on what are the key risks associated with this project, how are we addressing those risks in meaningful ways. The questioner points to a big challenge, and that is, do state agencies have the capabilities and the capacity, given that often they're very leanly staffed compared to the number of projects that they are regulating? Do they have the ability to follow up on those management plans and make sure those management plans are being implemented in ways that are effective and leading to the outcomes that are being promised? I think the first answer to that question is that state agencies need to have capability in-house to have specific units associated with impact assessment and impact management. It can be difficult to get the resources to put in place that capability, but it's really important that that capability exists. One way to get the resources is to have a fee paid for by the industry that provides enough resources for the impact assessment process to happen within the government, which includes management. It's very common practice in many, many different jurisdictions for fees to be associated with the submission of impact assessments, because those fees need to be used to run a proper process for oversight of the assessment and management plans. Another way to answer the question might be to open up the oversight on the sector around these issues. There's no reason why impact management plans should be private documents. They all should be public documents. There's no reason why those documents need not be agreements with communities, with local governments, with the state itself, in a participatory process where follow-up can happen by the communities that are being impacted by projects. That you can have a multi-stakeholder process rather than just a regulator and regulated process. There's examples of this in existing and working fairly well, particularly if you combine that agreement-making process with all of the social investments that we're talking about earlier, with the participatory monitoring we're talking about earlier. Having agreements in place opens up the oversight so that it's pressure from lots of different elements and can help companies themselves to address the issues in less conflictual ways, because you're building trust with local communities that you rely on to provide the so-called social license operate to work in that community. Another question here, given recent COP21 agreement, what actions are currently being taken by industry governments in mining and processing to develop alternative technology using no oil and gas? Well, this is a really big question, and it's a really new question because COP21 just finalized. As I understand it, they're still in the process of putting in place those commitments by industries and governments. But there are examples of countries putting in place price for carbon. And it's almost two separate questions here. One is, what is the incentive to move towards low emissions technologies and low emissions processes? And what are the practical technologies available to implement? So the incentive is provided by agreements at the international level. It's provided by prices that are being placed on carbon at the national level. And it's also provided by the fact that some low emissions technologies are now becoming cheaper than they have ever been before. On the other side, what technologies are available to replace high emissions technologies? Well, it obviously depends on the particular geographic circumstance and the particular industry that we're talking about. So, you know, that there are definitely circumstances where oil and gas is still going to be used into the foreseeable future, but there's also circumstances where, you know, renewable technologies and low emissions technologies are going to make more economic sense. In the mining industry, we're already seeing some sites, extraction sites, move towards low emissions technologies, move towards electric vehicles, move towards photovoltaic solar, providing energy for the mine site, move towards energy efficiency. So different processes for crushing, different processes for grinding, etc., to make the most of energy. There's also an energy-water relationship as well. So we talked a bit about saving water earlier in relation to paste and thickened tailings. There's also energy implications to that. And at the oil and gas, in the oil and gas sector, I think that the question is around fugitive emissions, particularly from gas flaring. One thing I talked about in the lectures that we had this week is unconventional oil and gas. Now, unconventional oil and gas tends to have a higher emissions profile at the point of extraction. Now, by unconventionals, we're talking about oil sands and tar sands, oil shale gas, underground coal gasification, coal seam gas, a whole series of different technologies that are different to conventional oil and gas. These technologies have a higher emissions profile at the extraction scale for a number of different reasons. One, they require a greater density of drilling. Two, there's a greater amount of gas flaring that tends to happen on site because of the way that the gas is transported from those multiple wells. Three, there tends to be greater compression that happens at those sites. By compression, I mean that you need to run diesel generators to compress the gas to then transport it. There is also some evidence of the release or escape of methane gas from the reservoirs themselves. Some people have associated with this with hydraulic fracturing. Sometimes the confined aquifers that are keeping those emissions, the methane trapped in those sedimentary layers and in the water, can breach and create some fugitive emissions. So there's a whole host of reasons why potentially unconventional gas can have a higher emissions profile. I think we've seen from data in the United States, industry data itself, that North America's emissions intensity from the oil and gas sector is in the increase because of the greater use of unconventional gas. So to some extent, the technologies are available now to shift towards lower emissions energy production. However, the incentives are still not there. I think it'll take some time for, excuse me, agreements like COP21 and other processes that put pressure on the price of carbon emissions emissions trading approaches to flow through the system to create the demand for these new technologies. But I think the time is there for the mining sector and the oil and gas sector to take this seriously, particularly if we want to continue to produce metals into the future, because the emissions intensity of mining will have to shift, and that might create huge implications for new types of mining. You know, maybe open cut mining with its huge requirements for diesel, for haul loading, may not be economical into the future. Maybe things like underground mass mining, where you have block caving, which is very, very large type of underground mining that is potentially a lower emissions type of mining. It has its other issues related to subsidence at the surface of the mine, but potentially different forms of mining will become more realistic options because of a pressure on carbon emissions limits. If that pressure isn't there, if it's not coming from governments, if it's not coming from a price signal, then that shift is going to be much slower than it needs to be. Okay, so I will take this last question. As you can tell, my voice is getting a little bit dry, having talked for the hour. Hopefully it's been a good discussion and you found it meaningful. The last question is, do I see any relation between future agreements for banning oil and gas and the falling prices for oil and gas? Since at some point oil and gas rich countries depend on the income from these may come into trouble. Okay, so I will say this, and that is that the interest in some forms of fossil fuel technologies is tending to decline. I think that there is a lack of confidence now in some sectors of the financial services industry, in the coal sector. There seems to be a structural decline in the price of coal, perhaps in part due to its emissions intensity and a reluctance from some funders to invest in large-scale thermal coal projects. Now, we need to be careful when we talk about coal and oil and gas and differentiate some of those types of coal, for example, that are necessary for a production process is important to development. For example, there's two main types of coal. There's thermal coal and there's metallurgical coal. Thermal coal is mined for the production of electricity. Metallurgical coal is mined for the coking of iron ore. The technology alternatives for the coking of iron ore are to use charcoal from plantation forests. But having said that, there's still likely to be a demand in the future for metallurgical coal for the production of iron ore, which is a key ingredient to most of the societies that are looking for a development outcome. So even though thermal coal might be something that in the future there becomes less confidence in, whether it's through the investors or whether it's through governments themselves, I still think for the foreseeable future, things like metallurgical coal will be important for coking of iron ore and other industrial processes. So we need to be very careful when we distinguish between different types of fossil fuel technologies. I do think that some forms of gas tend to be cleaner than other forms of gas. Some forms of oil production tends to be less emissions intense than others. If you create the price signal through emissions trading, through a carbon tax in a flat form, then I do think that creates the pressure for different options to be explored in different circumstances for use of different technologies. I do think that will impact on the economies that are very highly dependent on oil and gas into the future. But there are some reasons to believe that the current decline in oil and gas price is separated from this issue of carbon emissions. Okay, we're now at the top of the hour. I've rambled on for a good while. Thank you so much for joining us today on this MOOC. I hope you got a lot out of the lectures this week. I hope you got a lot out of the readings. I was happy to share with you the chapter on environment from my recent book, Mountain Movers. There's also the preface, and that is available there. It's an exclusive for the MOOC participants in this course. So I hope you got the advantage of reading that, and hope you enjoyed the session today. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to perhaps connecting with you in the future. All right, thank you very much.